All right, so this is chapter 21, Protist Evolution and Diversity. All right, so just a little outline. Basically, remember, and we've talked about this before, that these protists are broken up into something called supergroups. And so basically that is just a level or a taxonomic group that's right underneath domain. And so anyway, it's just a better way of classifying these protists, okay? And also remember that protists are eukaryotes, right? So now we're talking about eukaryotes. Our last chapter, we talked about bacteria and archaea. Now we're in domain eukarya, and we're going to talk about the protists, okay? So the most simple eukaryotes. All right, and so in terms of the supergroups, Archaeplastida, Chrome alveolata, excavata, and then Amoebozoa, Epistoconta, and Rhizaria. Those are the 6 supergroups, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about the general biology about the protists first, and then we'll talk about those specific groups. So again, I already mentioned this, right? So domain eukarya, and then the kingdom is protista. Remember, in domain eukarya, there are many different kingdoms, right? So protista is the kingdom we're talking about now. Endosymbiotic hypothesis, we talked about this before, again, because this is particularly proposed to explain how eukaryotic cells came from prokaryotic cells, okay? And in terms of the protists, they're very diverse, right? So they can be super simple, single-celled organism, like some of those we looked at in lab, right? Like amoeba or paramecium. And, you know, things like kelp and seaweeds can be 200 meters in length, okay? And again, remember that these guys are pretty complex, right? They're not prokaryotes, they're eukaryotes. Also, some protists can be colonial or filamentous. Again, we looked at examples of these in lab, colonial being the Volvox, filamentous being the Spirogyra. In terms of nutrition, some are photosynthetic. Many are heterotrophic, meaning they ingest food, right? Again, we saw the video of the amoeba ingesting the paramecium. Some can also be mixotrophic. So that's kind of a new term that we haven't probably used before. And basically they can combine autotrophic, making their own food, right, by photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, and then also being heterotrophic, depending on what's going on in the environment. In terms of life cycles, most of them will reproduce asexually, right? Basically kind of similar to what we think of as just normal cell division, right? There is instances where sexual reproduction may occur. So basically, if conditions are unfavorable, the protist can form a spore, right? And again, this is similar to what we talked about in bacteria with those endospores. Those spores then hang around for a really long time, right? And they can basically survive really cold temperatures, really hot temperatures, and then when conditions become favorable, they're able to then start to reproduce. Okay, so it says in parasites, the cyst may serve as a means of transfer to a new host. So again, when you think about things that form cysts and produce these spores, they're usually parasitic protists that may cause disease or problems within humans. Okay, in terms of, you know, photosynthetic forms of protists, right? Super important to the ecosystem. So obviously these guys will produce oxygen, and so they function as producers for oxygen in both freshwater and saltwater environments, right? So a major component of plankton are these photosynthetic protists. And so they serve as food for other protists, but they also then produce oxygen for that ecosystem. So whales actually feed on plankton. So again, remember, plankton is kind of a combination of different organisms, and a lot of them are, you know, composed of different types of protists. Again, I talked about this, right? That we're going to classify these guys into supergroups. Okay, and like I said, this has changed kind of over the years, and it might change again. But right now, based on what we know, these 6 supergroups seem to be the best way of classifying them. Okay, and so I remember I printed this out for you guys, so I think it's something to, and also the, let me see, that next table. Also that other table, both this and the table are super important to kind of keep with you as you're listening to the lecture or as you're studying, because it helps organize everything, right? Again, you can see domain eukarya, and then the 6 supergroups here, right? And then we'll talk about examples that fit into these 6 supergroups. Remember also that the book will sometimes then Also give you some other kind of categories within the supergroups, but I really want you guys to kind of just be able to categorize these examples that we give within the supergroup, okay? So like, I'm not going to really use terms like straminophils or maybe alveolates. We might, but remember that it's these 6 supergroups, and again, sometimes there's just other groups that are kind of put within there, but these are all the examples of different groups of organisms that we're going to talk about. Okay, again, just a reminder of the supergroups. Okay, and the sort of main, sort of components of each one. First one, Archaeplastida, red and green algae. Okay, it says also includes land plants. Again, remember these are supergroups that are right under domains. So there's going to be, other types of organisms or eukaryotes that fit within these as well. And so you can kind of see which protists are more closely related to plants and which ones might be more closely related to animals and fungi, right? So like the Pisaconta, the protists, the kind of example that we give are these choanoflagellates, and also animals and fungi fit within this group, okay? So these choanoflagellates are more animal-like, right, than they are plant-like. Okay. All right, so again, this is the table that I was referring to. Super helpful table because it gives you the supergroup, gives you some examples of members, distinguishing features, ecological roles, and then human interactions. To be honest, this is pretty much the chapter in a nutshell. Like if you know most of this, you're probably pretty good. Okay. Again, hits all the high points. What supergroup? What are some examples of members? And sort of why do we even care to talk about them? Right. All right. So green algae supergroup. So remember, we're talking about these guys within supergroups. So first one is Archaeplastida. Again, this supergroup will include land plants and other photosynthetic organisms. So most of what we're talking about in terms of the protists here are going to be photosynthetic protists, right? So green algae, they all can photosynthesize, all right? And so there's a lot of them, about 17,000 species, right? And lots of variety within these. It says many are symbionts, right? So they form symbiotic relationships with fungi, plants, or animals. Again, lots of diversity. A lot of them are unicellular, okay? But they can be both filamentous and colonial. And so again, the examples we saw in lab, our filamentous one was Spirogyra and colonial Volvox, okay? Again, green algae, green means photosynthesis. And like I told you before, we sort of can subdivide this group into 2 other main groups. But again, I want you to just think of supergroup Archaeplastida. What fits in within there? Green algae is one of the big ones, okay? And then we're going to give some examples of green algae. Here's one. Okay, so Chlamydomonas is basically a tiny little protist. It inhabits still freshwater pools, right? So it's aquatic, and it's super old. Apparently, it dates back over 1 billion years ago. Okay, so it has a cell wall, has a large chloroplast. As you can see, it's obviously, photosynthetic. We're talking about green algae, right? There's also, within that chloroplast, a pyronoid where starch is synthesized and stored. A lot of these guys also even have red eye spots, right? So if you think about Euglena that you might have seen in the lab before, sometimes I order them. They're going to fit within these guys, right? They can, they're green, they photosynthesize, and they have that little red spot, and they also have flagella that help them move around, okay? And so in fact, they have 2 flagella, right? And so here's a picture of this guy here. Again, you're not responsible for the anatomy of this protist. Okay, so here's an example of a single-celled green algae. Okay, in terms of how it reproduces, again, most often asexually, and so basically can just produce these daughter cells, right, within the parent cell, and then those daughter cells can escape by digesting the parent cell wall. Occasionally can reproduce sexually, okay, and basically you get these vegetative cells that'll form, these 2 haploid cells. So remember, if you think about our gametes, right, they're haploid, okay, and then when they join together, they form this diploid zygote. So it's the same idea here, right? Once this zygote forms, you get this really sort of heavy-walled resistant zygospore, right? So remember what I talked about in the beginning, that in general, if you're talking about sexual reproduction, it's the formation of these spores, right, or cysts. And then again, they can withstand extreme environmental conditions and then can reproduce when conditions become favorable. Okay, so obviously this is advantageous to the organism. Now, again, if the conditions are fine, it's just going to reproduce asexually, but it has this option if necessary. Okay, and so again, just like when we talked about the fungi in lab, right? You kind of have different names for these different spores, but it's the same idea, right? The endospore in bacteria, a cyst, or spores, all the same idea. It's this kind of, means of sexual reproduction that, again, these things can lie dormant for a while and then reproduce when conditions are favorable. Okay? All right. So here is just showing you the life cycle. Again, you're going to see a lot of life cycles throughout this chapter. You're not responsible for memorizing the life cycle in any way, okay? But this is just kind of just showing you, this is the sexual reproduction life cycle, and you can see the formation of these zygospores, and then eventually they'll produce zoospores that can then, mature into a full, a mature chlamydomonas, okay? All right, another example. Okay, again, another example of a green algae, okay, within supergroup Archaeplastida volvox. We saw this in lab. These guys are colonial, okay? So again, we're giving kind of just examples of different types. The first one was a single-celled green algae. Now this is a colonial green algae. It's still technically single-celled, but these single cells join together to form a colony, okay? Which appears to be a multicellular type of organism, okay? So hollow sphere, again, thousands of cells are arranged in a single layer surrounding this sort of water interior, and they each have flagella that will beat in a coordinated fashion. And within that colony, there's specialized cells. So some are specialized for reproduction, okay? And so it says they can each divide asexually to form a daughter colony within that parental colony, and then that daughter colony can leave and basically form a new volvox. Remember, again, when you look at them, those kind of darker green little circles that were within the bigger one, those are the daughter colonies, right? So if you look here, see these are the daughter colonies. And, this is the entire volvox. These are the vegetative cells, and here are the daughter colonies. Okay, these guys will break away to form a new volvox. Okay, now ulva is actually a multicellular green algae. Okay, and so commonly called sea lettuce. So again, these are kind of, you think of seaweeds and kelp, sea lettuce. These are all protists. These are multicellular protists. Okay, so again, you can have variations. Can be, as small as 2 cells thick, or it can be as much as a meter long. The reproductive cycle of ulva is very similar to what is seen in plants. Okay, and so that's why we're mentioning this alternation of generations, super similar to what you see in plants. Therefore, it's believed that this is a sort of, an ancestor to plants. Okay. And again, here is, here showing you the sea lettuce ulva, and you can see this life cycle. Again, nobody needs to memorize the life cycle. Okay. So again, it's alternation of generations because it alternates between the haploid and the diploid state. All right. Another example, Spirogyra. This is a filamentous green algae, okay? We looked at this in lab as well. And so these filaments basically are end-to-end chains of cells. So the volvox those cells were arranged in a sphere. In the Spirogyra, they're arranged end-to-end, and they look like a long filament, okay? And so you see these guys in surfaces of ponds and streams, kind of what we probably think of or we call algae on the surface. That, a lot of it is composed of these guys. Inside, you kind of see this ribbon-like or kind of crisscross pattern of the chloroplasts, one way to identify them. In terms of sexual reproduction, these guys are a little unique. So they do something called conjugation, where these two Spirogyra will line up next to each other, and actually one will basically donate all of its cellular contents to the other, and then that other one will divide to produce more. Okay, that's what this is telling you here. All right, and so they'll form this diploid zygospores, and then in the spring you'll get new haploid filaments that form. Okay, so this is showing you, here's this guy, these two lined up, conjugation, he's donating all of the cellular contents to him. This will sort of hang out until the spring, and then we'll basically finish the reproduction when conditions are favorable. Another example of a green algae, right, Chara. basically lives in freshwater lakes and ponds. It's commonly called a stonewort. So again, it looks like a little aquatic plant, right? I mean, that's what it is, but it's not a plant. It's a protist, okay? And so you can kind of see here, like this is one individual plant, and then they kind of have sort of several of these, right? So it says several individuals that are kind of attached to each other. It makes it look like a sort of bigger organism. All right. Now, those are all green algae, right? We're still in the same supergroup. Now, if we talk about red algae, these guys in particular have a particular economic importance to us. So we exploit them a lot for certain products. And so when we, again, think of red algae as seaweeds, okay? These are multicellular seaweeds. They look red because they have red and blue pigments, okay? But again, that's how they photosynthesize. You don't always have to use a green pigment, chlorophyll. There's other types of pigments that can be used in photosynthesis. So there's not as many species of these guys. I guess there's a little less diversity than in the green algae because, again, most of these are multicellular seaweeds. Mostly live in warm water. And again, in terms of economic importance, we basically use red algae for agar, okay, which can be used for capsules for drugs, dental impressions, cosmetics, culture media, electrophoresis, food prep. So again, when you guys had your bacterial plates that you swabbed to see if anything grew, what you swabbed was agar. It's agar with, some nutrients added to it. Carrageen is another type of emulsifying agent that's used in the production of chocolate and also cosmetics. So if you look at, a package of chocolate or even like almond milks and stuff like that, you'll probably see carrageen in there. Also, obviously, sushi, the outsides of sushi rolls, these are red algae as well. So remember, there's different types. Okay, so now we're in the next supergroup here. So now we're in chrome alveolata, okay? So again, these are divided up again into these straminopiles and these alveolates. Let's just think of supergroup chrome alveolata and then what, examples we have in there. So again, in general, brown algae, diatoms, golden brown algae, and water molds are going to fit in here, okay? So in supergroup Archaeplastida, it's green algae and red algae, right? And with the green algae, there was a lot of diversity. So we talked about a single-celled, we talked about colonial, filamentous, and then a multicellular green algae. All right, so for brown algae, again, not as many. They're going to live in colder ocean waters, multicellular. So again, these are like kelps. Some can be small, others might be really large. And again, they look brown because of, I don't know why that does that all the time. They look brown because their pigments are a brown color, okay? And it says excess food is stored in a carbohydrate called laminarin. So usually when you think of plants, right, they store excess carbohydrate or glucose in the form of starch, right? And we saw that in that, remember our first example of that green algae? Here, these guys have a specific different type of storage carbohydrate. And so it's the reason why we mention it is because it's sort of unique to these brown algae. And so like this guy, laminaria, is named after that storage carbohydrate, okay? And you can see other examples as well. Again, these brown algae are like kelps, right? All right, again, let's okay. So I think we're just kind of really talking just about the brown algae here. I'm not sure why we're kind of lumping green algae in here. I want you guys, again, if you're thinking about chrome alveolata, think about brown and golden brown algae, okay? These seaweeds and these kelps. Again, remember there are some, green algae that are seaweeds as well, but they're different, okay? So these were some of these other ones that we mentioned before. These are just giving you, again, some other examples of different species of these seaweeds and kelp. Okay, you guys don't need to know these specific species names at all right? Again, but the one thing you should know is that they're used for food and fertilizer, okay? Again, just like we talked about with the red algae, right? There are forms of brown algae that we use for things, in food products. So algin, again, in particular brown algae, we use algin as a thickener for foods like ice cream, sherbet, and cream cheese. So again, if you kind of look at packaging, you might see some of these things or ingredients in the ingredient list. Okay, one other thing to kind of mention that's unique about laminaria, right, is that it shows something called tissue differentiation. So basically, it has a sort of specific tissue that looks like or resembles the phloem of plants, right? So if you talk about plants, the two main vascular tissues in plants in terms of transport or transporting nutrients and transporting water around the plant, you have the xylem and the phloem. And I guess the laminaria is kind of the first example of showing something similar to a phloem, okay? Most of these brown algae have this alternation of generations, again, very plant-like, okay? So two things that are similar to plants. This tissue that resembles the phloem and also this alternation of generations, reproductive cycle. Within this supergroup, again, Chroma violata, we have diatoms. Okay, so it says the most numerous unicellular algae in the oceans. So these guys are unicellular, and they also have this kind of unique silica shell that, like, if you look at them microscopically, it's like pretty and sort of ornate. Okay, so kind of different than what we talked about before. A lot of plankton, or a significant portion of plankton, are made up of diatoms. Also, other protists as well, but a lot of them are diatoms, okay? And another thing we use these for is something called diatomaceous earth. So it says it uses the remains of the diatoms, again, because it has this silica shell, right? It's used as a filtering agent, a soundproofing agent, or a polishing abrasive, because when you kind of have all these little bits and pieces of this sort of silica shell, it provides that sort of abrasiveness that you might need in these types of agents. Same thing, if you look, even toothpaste, sometimes you might see it. So look at ingredients and see if you see this. Here's some examples. So let's give you an example of diatoms here, but then also dinoflagellates too. We'll just mention these guys a little bit in a second. But these guys also kind of have this shell, but it's different, right? This is a silica shell. This is showing you that these are made out of cellulose. And the reason why they're called dinoflagellate is you kind of have this sort of dinosaur kind of skin-like structure on the outside. Okay. So golden brown algae within this supergroup as well. You can have unicellular, colonial. Again, they look golden brown because of the pigments that they contain, okay? As many of these guys, like this species here or this genus here, are mixotrophs, right? So remember, they can photosynthesize and phagocytose, right? So they can eat their own food, they also can photosynthesize, and they contribute to plankton as well. Okay, so here's an example of this guy, or of this genus of golden brown algae. I mean, kind of looks similar to the Chlamydomonas that we saw in the beginning, right? Again, he's got these flagella that help him move around, and again, it has this brownish color because of the pigments that exist in order to photosynthesize. Water molds, exactly as they say. So they're not fungi. These guys are protists, but they sort of look very mold-like. And they'll parasitize fish or insects, right, in the water. And so, but not all of them live in the water, right? So there are some that live on land and can parasitize insects and plants on land. There's about 700 species, so not as many of these. Most are saprotrophic. So remember, we should know what that term means. If you're a saprotroph, you can release enzymes, digestive enzymes into the environment. They then break down larger molecules, to which then you can take in those more simple molecules and basically get energy from them, right? And so saprotrophs are super important to the ecosystem. These guys, I guess, were responsible for the potato famine in Ireland and also mildew of grapes in France. So again, they're not only in the water and they're not only there just to, get rid of dead fish, they also can have, impacts to the human population. All right, let's look at a picture of these guys, right? So you can see these kind of filaments, and then, again, surrounding this dead goldfish. And what it's going to do is going to release enzymes, break down, proteins and larger molecules, so that then those smaller molecules can be taken in and energy can be derived from them. And not only taken in by the water mold, but also by other surrounding organisms as well. All right, so I told you we were going to just mention dinoflagellates a little later. We just had the picture earlier. So these guys have these sort of protective cellulose plates. Remember I showed you that? They kind of look, I don't know, sort of dinosaur skin-like. And then there's also, I guess, silicates in there as well. So that's why we kind of showed the picture with the diatoms together, because they sort of have this sort of shell, I guess. and 2 flagella, okay, that again help with movement. Okay, one thing to kind of mention about dinoflagellates in particular, okay, is some sort of, impacts on other organisms. So the first one is in coral, okay, so they form a symbiotic relationship with the coral, and so they basically will provide their host with nutrients, and then the corals will provide waste that help fertilize the algae, and so there's this symbiotic relationship. Some of these dinoflagellates can lack chloroplasts and actually are parasitic. It depends, okay? But so here's one example of dinoflagellates that form the symbiotic relationship with corals. There's also other species. So the species in particular of dinoflagellates can cause something called a red tide. And basically, when a lot of these protists, these dinoflagellates, flourish in the water, they can produce a neurotoxin, and then that neurotoxin can kill the fish there. And basically, if you eat fish that were infected before they actually die, you could actually end up with a respiratory okay, and other organisms obviously as well. So any other animal that might eat the shellfish might have a problem too because of this. Okay, so again, dinoflagellate can cause red tide. They produce this neurotoxin that can cause that the fish can eat, and then that will affect other organisms as well. Here's showing you this dinoflagellate bloom in fish kill. Okay, so again, you kind of see this bloom, meaning all this extra, algae, or sometimes you call it an algae bloom, but it's really dinoflagellate, sort of reddish color, and that's where this comes from. Okay, within chrome alveolata, still, right? We're still in here. There are ciliates, okay? And so if you're a ciliate, it means you have cilia, okay? We saw paramecium, lots of cilia on the outside of them, and they move around pretty quickly, okay? Most of these guys are heterotrophs, and they can basically swallow their food whole. They have a sort of particular type of reproduction in that they divide by something called transverse binary fission. Basically, it's two of the cells dividing. And you have these two sort of different nuclei, one that's, for reproduction and one that's for metabolism. So kind of unique. You don't really see that in, we haven't talked about that before. For sexual reproduction, it involves conjugation and exchange of haploid nuclei, right? Because they have this kind of reproductive nuclei. And so we talked about conjugation with the Spirogyra, okay? Conjugation also happens in bacteria, right? A particular type of ciliate, I'm not even going to try to say this, right? Ichthyopitherius, right? I said it, I guess. Is a ciliate that can cause a fish disease called ick. Okay, so again, some of these guys affect, other organisms. So here are some examples. We saw these, right? So this is basically showing you the sort of conjugation of these two, right? They first unite, and then they'll basically exchange nuclei. Here's your paramecium, and you can see all the cilia here, and again, not responsible for the anatomy or anything like that. Another example, stentor. All right. Another group of organisms within this supergroup, chrome alveolata, is something called apicocomplexans. Oh my God, I can't say that either. These guys are nasty, okay? So this group, basically they are parasites. So it says obligate parasites, meaning obligate, they in order for them to survive, they depend on another host, okay? These guys form spores that can then be transmitted between different organisms, particularly humans, right? And cause disease, okay? So Plasmodium, a particular genus, causes malaria. Okay, and it's transmitted by the mosquito, and we're going to, talk a little bit more detail about the life cycle of it in a second. Another type, Toxoplasma gondii, this protist causes something called toxoplasmosis, and it can infect cats and humans, and it can cause birth defects in humans. And so I said this in class, but this is, when you hear that pregnant women shouldn't change litter boxes, and it's because of the potential presence of this protist that can cause disease. All right, so here's the life cycle of Plasmodium vivax. I gave you guys a handout that has this life cycle on there. You are responsible for knowing, these steps and sort of the major things that are happening at each one of these steps. So remember, it needs a host or a vector, right, to transmit, to move around this protist, and that's how that disease is transmitted, through this mosquito, okay? And so basically you can follow along here. So it says in the gut, the female mosquito, again, the female mosquito can basically injects into the bloodstream and basically can bite a human and pull blood out, right? But you can see the protist, the Plasmodium vivax, the gametes get inside, right? And so they get inside the gut of the mosquito. Those gametes fuse, and the zygote undergoes many divisions, okay, and then produces these sporocytes. And then those sporocytes, you can kind of see this here, those sporocytes then migrate to the salivary glands, right? And so when that mosquito then goes and bites another human, right, those sporozoites, right, move then into that human, okay? And then more things happen, right? And so this life cycle sort of then continues if you follow this here. You have other types of spores, these myrizoites that are produced in the liver cells. They enter the bloodstream and then enter the red blood cells. And they sort of change forms. I'm not so concerned that you guys get all of these names in particular, right? But we should know the sort of sequence of events, right? That you're going to get these sporozoites formed in the gut of the mosquito. They then travel to her salivary glands. Once it bites a human, gets into the bloodstream, right? Goes to the liver, okay? Eventually then goes back to the red blood cells. If you follow along here, when those once they're in the red blood cells rupture, and basically these myrizoites can invade and reproduce asexually inside new red blood cells, right? So they keep infecting other red blood cells. And then these toxins essentially are released, okay, when these blood cells rupture, and that's what causes the disease. All right, so we should know this. All right, another supergroup here, excavata. Okay, so we're finally out of what supergroup were we there before? Chrome alveolata. So there was a lot of examples from supergroup Archaeplastida, was particularly the green algae, and then Chrome alveolata really had a lot of diversity within it in terms of some of these different groups, okay? So you talked about the brown algae, those were fine, whatever, some golden brown algae, but then we started kind of getting into some different types of these guys, and in particular, these parasitic types, okay? All right, excavata. It says they have an atypical or absent mitochondria and a distinctive flagella, okay? So I kind of mentioned that Chlamydomonas kind of looks like Euglena, right? Similar, but not the same. We're going to talk about these guys here. So these euglenids, right? So like the Euglena are freshwater unicellular organisms. Pretty difficult to classify. So they sort of have two flagella and an eye spot, just like we talked about before. And they're green, right? So they photosynthesize. So you can kind of see this here. The chloroplast in particular is unique because it has 3 membranes rather than 2. And within the chloroplast, again, there's another unusual type of carbohydrate that's produced called paramyelin. You don't need to know the name of this, but just kind of know that these guys are unique because of some of these things. So you guys can see the anatomy here and how this is a little bit unique, right? But it does look similar to some of the other things we saw before. Okay, again, another type of protist that's gonna cause disease, okay? So these parabolsalids, unicellular, okay, it says they're endosymbionts of animals. Again, they lack mitochondria, so they rely on fermentation for ATP production, okay? So they can't do, aerobic respiration. These guys, unfortunately, are well known because they cause diseases, okay? So here's this particular species that basically is a sexually transmitted protist, okay? And so it, causes a sexually transmitted disease. So when you talk about sexually transmitted diseases, doesn't only have to be, viral or bacterial. There are also protists as well. Another kind of group, these diplomonads, again, unicellular, endosymbionts of animals, similar to, in terms of in general, to the parabosalids, right? Same thing, cause disease. So here's an example of the species Giardia lamblia, can attach to the human intestinal wall, causes severe diarrhea. And the way you get this is that there are, again, if you're going to talk about something that's going to cause disease, a lot of times they form these cysts or these spores, right? So the cysts can basically be in water, and you can get this by drinking contaminated water. And apparently beavers are transmitters of these cysts. And so I guess there's examples of hikers, right, out hiking, and they might fill their water bottle up with, water from a pond or something like that. And unfortunately, they can end up getting or ingesting this protist, and it leads to severe diarrhea. This is kind of showing you here, right? So this is showing you this Giardia basically sucking or grabbing onto the inside of the intestinal wall. Okay, that's what that's showing you here. And so you can see these sort of characteristic markings from where it was other ones had it before. Again, more protists that cause disease. Okay, so kinetoplastids, same thing, unicellular, they're flagellated. The reason why they're called kinetoplastids is because they have something called a kinetoplast, which is a large mass of DNA located in the mitochondria. So these guys have mitochondria. The reason why we want to, kind of be concerned about them is that they cause diseases. So one species, Trypanosoma cruzi, causes something called Chagas disease. Another one, Trypanosoma brucei, causes African sleeping sickness. And just like we kind of talked about malaria, this is actually transmitted by an insect vector, but by this specific species of fly. Okay, so again, more protists that can cause disease. And if you look at a blood sample, right, of someone that you might suspect is infected with one of these, you can actually look and you can actually see the protist in the blood, in the blood smear, essentially. All right, kind of we lump the last three together and we're almost done, right? So amoebozoa, episacantha, and rhizaria. Amoebozoans, we saw amoeba, okay? These guys don't have flagella, they don't have cilia, right? They move basically by pseudopods, and essentially it kind of looks like, cytoplasm just kind of streaming forward. And when we looked at the amoeba microscopically, you could see the cytoplasm streaming forward. And that's how they also ingest their food, okay? So they use phagocytosis to ingest their food. There are some types of amoebozoans that are parasites, right? And that can cause disease. So this particular type of, or species of amoeba, is a parasite of the human colon. And it basically causes dysentery, which is severe diarrhea, and it can actually be fatal, okay? This is basically showing you, a sort of picture of amoeba. So this is amoeba proteus, and again, you don't need to know the anatomy, but you can see how this guy looks a lot different than all the ones that we talked about before. Also, you can have slime molds. Okay, so these plasmodial slime molds and cellular slime molds. We didn't have any examples of these in lab or anything like that. But these basically just have kind of different types of body types, and they are just important in terms of being decomposers. So they feed on dead plant material, and again, they're going to feed on dead plant material, break it down further so that it can be used by other members of the ecosystem. Okay, and so this is showing you here these plasmodial slime molds, and kind of like you can kind of see this looks almost like sort of mushroom-like, right? And basically you can look at this life cycle and kind of see how it compares to some of the other things we talked about. Again, you don't need to know this life cycle. So just know that the slime molds, right, are part of amoebozoa. They are part of that group. Piscicants, these guys include both unicellular and multicellular. Choanoflagellates are an example of or a member of this supergroup, and they're animal-like. Okay, and so again, if you think about episcicants, animals and fungi are going to fit within this supergroup. Okay, so they're unicellular, well as colonial forms. Some of these guys are filter feeders. right? And so basically the water can flow kind of through them, and they basically can take in food particles by phagocytosis. So another example of episcons that are kind of unique are something called nuclearids. And so they have these thread-like pseudopods, or these kind of, think of them as just kind of extensions, cellular extensions that are super thin, okay? And they actually can feed on algae or cyanobacteria. And they're believed to be related to fungi. All right, so this is showing you an example of a colonial choanoflagellate. Okay, here, two different examples. And this is the nuclear that I was talking about before, right? So see these little thin thread-like extensions? These are these Philopodia, right? So if we go back here. Oh, where did we go? Oops, sorry. What the heck? Where did we talk about this? Did I miss that here? Oh, sorry, here, right? These Philopodia, that's what these are. Rhizarians, so again, we're in supergroup Rhizaria. We kind of lumped all these together. They're comprised of something called foraminiferans and also radiolarians, and there's different species within these groups. But these guys have a skeleton, or kind of like an exoskeleton, that you call a test, or you can think of it as a shell. Just like with the diatoms, we had the silica shell. These guys have same thing, kind of have this exoskeleton that's actually, again, that we call a test, that's made up of calcium carbonate. Okay, so there are these white cliffs of Dover in England. So I'll show you a picture. There are these cliffs. They're actually made from deposits of these foraminiferans, right? So they're basically the calcium carbonate tests, or kind of like shells, right? That cause the white color there. And the pseudopods will extend through the openings of those tests. Okay. So I'll show you in a second a picture. Radiolarians have a silicon test instead of a silicone test instead of a calcium carbonate test. Okay, again, think of the test as just a shell. And all right, so again, has these pseudopods, right? So see here, so here's an example. Here's the test, right? The shell, and then this is the protists extending these pseudopods out through the openings there. This is also showing these white cliffs of Dover. These are formed by basically remains of, these tests, these radiolarian tests. And you can see they're pretty cool looking, right? Super small, right? They're enlarged. This is an electron micrograph. And thank goodness that is the end.